So let's start right at the beginning. So when did you first realise that something wasn't right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think I didn't actually find out I had ADHD until I was 14 years old. And I think I found out what ADHD was about 4 years before that, when my husband was diagnosed. And until then, I had no idea what ADHD was. I thought it was just, naughty boy syndrome, and that was it. So those 36 years before I knew what the issue was, it had a different name, if you like. So the earliest thing I was aware of was anxiety. So at the age of about 6 or 7, I developed anxiety and panic attacks, which really came from nowhere, because I was very privileged to be brought up in a loving home, secure home, with no issues. There was no reason for me to have developed, this worry and anxiety. And for me, it was all around food. And I eventually developed a phobia of being sick, which is emetophobia, and that grew, if you like, or lasted throughout my whole adult life, until I was diagnosed with ADHD and treated with ADHD for ADHD. Then I suppose, so as a child it would have been anxiety, and then when I moved into adulthood and began adulting, which the adult ADHD community refer to as being a very difficult thing to adult unless you're treated and your ADHD is well managed. So that shift from, an environment that was safe and secure, to me having to fend for myself and be autonomous and, manage my own life was really difficult for me. And that happened when I got to university, and I suffered from depression at that point. And then on and off throughout my sort of 20s and early 30s, I suffered from depression. There was another sort of peak after I had my children, and the difficulty with sleep deprivation, which we know now has a massive impact on the ADHD brain. And I suffered from, what most people would call postnatal depression, because of the amount of things I had to cope with, and, having a small baby and so on. And then it wasn't then until I was 40 that I realised that, actually I had ADHD, and that's made an enormous difference. And all those other problems, if you like, resolved themselves.
So you mentioned that your husband also has ADHD.
Yes.
And that was kind of a route to realising that you had ADHD too.
Yes.
So can you tell me a bit more about how that panned out?
Yeah, so he suffered from a major depressive episode after we had my daughter. And I suppose at the time, although my friend who had been diagnosed herself in the States shared with me her diagnosis and what ADHD was, and that put it on the radar for me. And I immediately thought of my husband, because he was the priority in our life at that time, because he wasn't well. I suppose up until that point, I'd always assumed that my issue was my phobia. Everything revolved around that. That's the label I'd given myself. So I didn't think about myself. I didn't think about it applying to myself at that point. And it wasn't until I started looking into what ADHD was after he was diagnosed, understanding that it was genetic. We had 2 young children at this point. So I'm thinking, well, my children, at least one of them is bound to have this as well. We could see the pattern in his family of other people who who were undiagnosed, because most people with ADHD can see other members of the family that they recognise have the symptoms. And I was doing a lot of research, and I read Ned Halliwell's book called Driven to Distraction. And the great thing about it is that it's mini case studies of all the people that he's diagnosed, children and adults. And I got to a case study of a 30-something woman who, she couldn't really pinpoint what was wrong in her life, and at the same time she wasn't coping and nothing was right. And I really recognised myself in that. And it suddenly just dawned on me, actually, I have this too. And I was duly diagnosed.
Okay. So you mentioned that your children also have ADHD.
Yes.
So when did you first realise that something wasn't quite right there?
Yeah, so my children are 8 and nearly 6 at the moment. My daughter was diagnosed formally last year. My son is in the process of being diagnosed, but I'm sure that he will be. For me, the earliest sign for them was actually really, really right at the beginning as babies, which was issues with sleep. So my children really never slept for longer during the day, for instance, for longer than about those 45-minute cycles. Whereas all my friends, their children would sleep 2-3 hours during the day. Mine never did, and my 6-year-old actually only stopped waking up in the night around the age of 5. So I think that was the earliest. And then the other sort of symptoms of, my boy being very hyperactive early on in nursery, my daughter not listening, needing to sort of ask her to tune in to me. And really, because I knew what I was looking for, I could see those symptoms very early on at the nursery stage. And actually, my daughter's reports from nursery were used as part of the diagnosis.
Okay, so what did they say?
She's even at the age of 2.5, will not sit down if she doesn't enjoy a task, doesn't always focus, is inattentive. They were sort of using these key words.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
One of the misconceptions I think around ADHD is that it's quite a new problem. So could you give me a bit of an overview about the history of ADHD?
Yeah. So actually there's mention of the patterns of inattention, difficulty concentrating, impulsive lack of control, way back in the 18th and 19th century, actually. The first time, I suppose, it was formally presented was as a so-called disorder of moral control by George Still, the founder of modern pediatrics, in the Lancet paper in 1902. That formulation pretty much mapped onto the current symptom profile. After that, what we see is an interest in thinking about those behaviours, inattention and so forth, as a form of minimal brain disorder or dysfunction. The idea that they were due to some sort of very subtle organic difficulty the children had. That was in the 1960s, 50s, 60s. That pretty soon came under attack because it was so non-specific. The children with those sorts of problems, of course, had many, many problems, and they weren't all around concentration or impulse control, reading problems, learning problems, and so forth. But people at least acknowledged that group of children existed. The next key stage was over in the States. The American Psychiatric Association, within their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, started to recognize this group of children. They initially called it reactive disorder of childhood. Then it quickly evolved into what we know today as ADHD. First of all, it was described as attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity. That was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And gradually it evolved into what we think of today as ADHD. That can be with attentional problems primarily, or impulsive, hyperactive type problems primarily, or both together. And that would be in, say, DSM-4, so the fourth version of this manual. Most recently, what we've seen is DSM-5 introduced, which hangs on to many of the aspects of that earlier formulation in the DSM-4, but it replaced those subtypes predominantly inattentive, prominently hyperactive, impulsive, and combined type with presentations, because they questioned how valid were these as separate subtypes of the disorder, because children seemed to kind of flip between one or another of them. So that's DSM-5, published in 2012. In parallel, the World Health Organization catalogue of mental disorders has had the concept of hyperkinetic disorder, which has evolved also over time. And in fact, the most recent version has essentially come to exactly the same point as the DSM, and both of them have ADHD as their formulation for this group of children.
So, is it the case that ADHD is restricted to childhood and adolescence?
I mean, certainly initially, the initial formulations focused on childhood. Now, those very early ones in the 18th and 19th century, going through to the early 20th century. And really, towards the middle and the end of the 20th century, with the DSM formulations, they were also focused on children and adolescents. But now we realise that many of those children, and we only know this really because we followed those children up, and many of them still either have full-blown ADHD or at least are suffering impairment from ADHD. So now we really think about ADHD as a lifespan condition, even to the extent now that people are calling for or identifying adults who have no history of childhood ADHD but are showing all the symptoms of ADHD in adulthood. So people are saying, well, actually, we need a new type of ADHD. We need a type called adult onset ADHD. And this really illustrates how the concept has evolved since the beginning of the 20th century with George Still, the disorder of moral control, right the way through to these notions of lifespan ADHD.
Well, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
In what ways are these behaviours different from normal everyday behaviour?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Because, of course, we all, there are times when we're maybe a little bit tired, we find it hard to concentrate, or we get a little bit more impulsive, a little more impatient with people. So those situations happen all the time, and they clearly aren't ADHD. So the crucial aspect of the diagnosis of ADHD is that the symptoms have to reach a certain level of severity, and they have to be accompanied by some other criteria. So they have to be associated with what's called impairment. So that is that the symptoms have to get in the way of your everyday functioning. So they have to have a negative impact, for instance, on your school performance, on your social relationships, on your relationships within the family. Now, it is true that the concept of impairment isn't very well specified, or actually the degree of impairment isn't very well specified in the diagnosis. And that's an area really for future work, research and development, for sure. But it has to be, that's the crucial. It's not just being inattentive and a bit active and a bit impulsive. It's